Today's guests are Cristina Fernandez-Valle and Houman Sadri. We join their conversation in the Faculty Lounge.
I was on a full year sabbatical, and I was very fortunate to get my second Fulbright grant, and I studied the region just before the conflict starts in Iraq.
So you were actually there when President Bush declared war? And
exactly.
Wow.
So my life can be sometimes adventurous.
Too exciting.
Yes, it's exciting. And the good thing about it is, when you're in the field, you learn a great deal about what is really happening. It's important to study a region by covering the literature about that area and exposing ourselves to different perspectives and ideas. But it's certainly something else to be in the area and see exactly how ordinary people are handling the situation, what is happening on day-to-day basis. I remember just before the declaration of war, there were all those maneuvers in Kuwait, where I was mainly stationed. So for me, waking up was before my alarm clock was by the sounds of the jet air maneuvering just above where I was living. And the opportunity also came to travel to other Persian Gulf states just during that same time period.
And that's what the Fulbright Scholarship or Fellowship allows you to do? It provides the funding for you to travel and spend a prolonged amount of time in the country you're studying?
Yes, that was one of the purpose of the funding. As you know, Fulbright grants are excellent opportunities to go overseas and study something and learn also about the region. The idea of Senator Fulbright was that as we learn more about other parts of the world and as they learn more about us, that would contribute to creating more cooperative type of relationship. And I certainly learned a great deal during that one, academic year in the region.
So you spent the full year in the Persian Gulf?
Full academic year, yes.
So it was 9 months.
Right.
And then, are you sponsored by another university there?
Well, the way Fulbright program works is we are attached to the cultural attaché or public affairs office of the U.S. Embassy. But in each one of the host countries, they usually find us a department and a university that they sponsor us in terms of, local arrangement and etc. So that was good.
And then once you're there, it's up to you to do the legwork and interview the right people and find access to the particular information you're interested in.
Exactly, and that was exactly what I was doing. I tried to meet as many officials as I could, and I conducted a number of interviews. And beyond that, I went and I did actually some surveys. I was interested in terms of public reaction to globalization, because following September 11, as you know, there were a number of groups that they were negatively reacting to globalization, and we think that we were targeted by one of those groups, Al-Qaeda to be more specific. Mm-hmm. So I was very much interested in finding out exactly what is happening in this region where Al-Qaeda had recruited a number of their personnel.
So that takes a lot of courage to go in and ask those kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's a courage that my wife usually discourages.
Did you find the population cooperative?
Well, that's a really good question. Because yes, there were a number of people who were very cooperative. But there were some other individuals who, how should I put it, they were a lot less cooperative. And especially although I speak some of the native languages in the area, and that made it much easier for me in many regards. But there were some people who were just naturally, they were kind of suspicious of some Muslim Americans coming to the region and asking all these questions and wanting to meet as many people as possible. So I guess that was natural. It takes sometimes a few months to create a trust, relationship with a number of people, and then after that they were very open in terms of expressing their ideas. So I saw some very positive reaction, and I saw a lot less positive reaction.
Do you think the individuals that were not so positive might have feared repercussion from the government in any way? Because as a Cuban American, I know that I have not gone back to Cuba, but I know that it's frowned upon. You don't want to spend a lot of time talking to Americans that do visit the island. Do you think that's the same situation?
Well, Kuwait was, which was my main, area. Kuwait is a very interesting case. Kuwaitis have actually experienced a great deal of independence, and they've been very free in terms of expressing their ideas. And among the Arab states in the Persian Gulf region, Kuwait, I would say, is, if it's not the freest, is one of the freest. So they were very candid in terms of expressing their ideas, both in favor or against U.S. or their own system, etc. That was not much of a issue. The interesting part of it for me was there were certain layers of the society, and there were certain groups that I was trying to learn a little bit more about. Establishing good relationship with them so we can communicate, that was I wouldn't say a problem, but it was a challenge. But I like meeting challenges.
And deadlines, I hear, too.
I like meeting deadlines, that's true.
So when you come back from a Fulbright period abroad, do you have a deliverable? Do you need to write that paper, write that book? What do you do with all this information? You spent 9 months in a foreign country. Right. What's the next step?
Well, as you guessed, I have tremendous amount of data. I have already presented actually 3 of those, projects that I was working on in form of conference papers at 3 different conferences. And my main task, however, is to put all this in form of a book. And I'm already working on my second book. The title of that is Intercultural and International Relations from Conflict to Cooperation. So a lot of that material is going to go to that book.
And then when you collect data, do you have audio tapes or videotapes? Or you said you did some surveys, so you actually have some data that you can crunch. But how do you collect your data?
It depends on my audience. Some people very simply do not like to be videotaped. That's one thing I learned about the region. Some people do not like to be videotaped. Some people do not like to be taped at all. Some people do not want to, for example, be given a questionnaire and mark it. And sometimes my, even surveys end up being like very informal conversation, sitting around a cup of coffee or tea and talking with somebody. Or when they invited me, when they showed their hospitality and invited me to their homes, as I was sitting around the table, or many times actually, depending on how traditional they were, some traditional families, they actually sit on the floor and, eat and, having those type of conversation without making it very formal. So I have data in almost every form you can imagine, and I use different ones for different purposes.
So some of those you have to go back and write down your recollections because memory fades with time.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I learned very early in terms of doing this type of research was immediately following such a meeting, I would basically isolate myself and would go over the conversation I had, and I would put down as much information as I could. Luckily, I have pretty good memory and has served me very well. So that has been very helpful.
So I'm really interested in the first book you published.
Well, my first book was called Revolutionary States, Leaders, and Foreign Relations. It has something to do with my experience. I was born in Iran, and my life changed with Iranian Revolution. So I became very much interested in the behavior of revolutionary states and their leaders. So by the time I got to the PhD level, I guess I had enough, academic ammunition, and I felt comfortable to look at 3 case studies of revolutionary states among the third world countries or developing countries in the Cold War period. What I did was I compared the first 10 years of the post-revolution period of China, Cuba, and Iran. So 3 countries from 3 completely different geographic regions with very different backgrounds.
Different cultures.
Different cultures, different religions, different everything. My purpose was to find some kind of similar pattern, if there is such a thing, in terms of their foreign relations with the superpowers, U.S. and USSR. This was the Cold War, case studies. And interesting enough, after digging and digging some more, I found that all 3 countries, they went through a process of 3 stages of foreign relations with the 2 superpowers. During the first period, they basically treated both superpowers pretty much the same. During the second stage, as their own confidence increased and they felt more secure in their own state, they started becoming more conflictual toward one of the 2 superpowers. And then this situation continues, and their foreign policy in general starts becoming more conflictual and less cooperative. Then some kind of either domestic or international challenge comes up that they cannot resolve it, or it really affect them in a very major way. Then their foreign policy shows signs of softening. Now, I'm not suggesting that all 3 case studies, by the end of the first decade, they were completely cooperative members of the international community, but there were very obvious signs of, change of foreign policy. And the reason I studied the first 10 years was that was the period of time that the revolution was not completely institutionalized. So that was one of the best period to study. So that's what I did.
How old were you when you left Iran? Because your family left because of political unrest, right?
Well, actually, my parents, although my father was a university professor and he was doing consulting for the United Nations, my father was an engineer by profession. He was an agricultural engineer, and in addition to his academic position, he was also a consultant for FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations. So we used to travel a great deal. And I know some people think it's glamorous, but if you are a student and you end up with your family moving like sometimes twice during the same academic year, it's not fun.
And you had siblings?
Yes, I have 2 sisters and 1 brother.
So that helps. At least you always have your siblings.
Right, that was nice. That was nice. And in terms of age, we were not really far apart. We have like 3-4 years of age difference, so that was fine. But yeah, we traveled a great deal. So just before Iranian Revolution, just about a year before Iranian Revolution, in 1978, my parents, they decided to send me to live with my uncle in Arizona to learn English.
Wow, what an adjustment.
And that was it.
And how old were you?
I was a teenager.
You're like 13, 14?
You don't
have to age yourself, I'm sorry.
That's fine. I was just about 17.
Okay. So that was a great shock. That was the first time you had been in the U.S.
That was my first trip. It wasn't my, when my parents eventually they came, that wasn't their first trip, but it was my first trip to U.S. because I had well-traveled in Europe, Africa, Asia, other parts of the world, but I haven't been in Americas. So that was my first trip to U.S., right.
And then you did your PhD in Virginia.
Right. I basically did all my education in my home state of Arizona, all the way up to master's. And then one of my mentors suggested that if I want to pursue academic life in the U.S., I would be better off to, get my PhD from a nationally known university. And my training all the way up to the end of master's was highly quantitatively oriented, which is very unusual for a social scientist at that time. So they suggested that I should go to a school which is very well known for theory in terms of international relations. I went to University of Virginia. I was very fortunate to get there and finish my PhD in '93. And then I had some temporary job opportunities right after graduate school. I was very lucky. I had a temporary position as a replacement for a faculty member who was on sabbatical at one of the universities there, University of Richmond. And then after that, my mentors, they suggested you should seriously go to the market and look for a real job. So I went to the market, and UCF position was one of the positions that I had applied for and interviewed for. And their offer was better than anybody else's, and I was always interested in joining a young school. Opportunities for growth, and I really liked the plan for future of UCF, and this is in 1995. We were a lot smaller school then. We were only about, if I'm not mistaken, only 24,000.
It's amazing how much it's grown. I
How
came
much
in
we have grown.
'96, and it's
Exactly.
a totally different university almost.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a very, it has grown tremendously. So that was it. And in 1995, I accepted the position and I joined the Department of Political Science.
So you left Iraq. It's similar to my upbringing, because it's interesting that you had studied the revolutionary period of Cuba, because the reason I'm in the United States is because I was born in Havana, and my family was well established there, had lived there many, many generations, and they came to America for the political unrest.
Right.
And so what can you tell me about the similarities between the Castro regime and Khomeini's regime during, so you can expand a little bit more about your book.
Okay. Well, Cuba after 1969 went through a major, 59 went to a major revolution in terms of changing the entire system. And that was one of the reasons that I studied Cuba. Interesting enough, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of similarities, it was, of course, very unique in Cuban history. But when you compare Cuban case with some other third world countries, it was not that unusual. And their foreign policy was, went through the same type of stage. Cuba is a very interesting case study for a number of reasons. I remember years ago when I was reading Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger used to say, Cuba is a small country but has a great country foreign policy for a small country. Cuba has been active during the Cold War, for example, in Africa.
Right. They
Yes.
had in Angola, they had sent an army to Angola.
Oh yes, Angola and a number of other, African countries have seen Cuban forces, both military forces, and also what is so interesting about Cuba is, as a part of their foreign aid, they've been sending their doctors and teachers to different countries, especially in Africa. They are very popular still. They're very popular because of their foreign aid in that regard.
So, did the regime last longer than you thought it would?
You mean in Cuba?
Yes. What do you have in your crystal ball for when that's
Well,
how that's going to resolve?
That's a good question, but I'm not a Latin American expert.
Oh, okay.
I think in some ways a number of people are probably impressed with how persistent the regime has been, especially in the post-Cold War period.
Yeah.
I mean, look at all of those regimes in Eastern Europe that
They all changed.
They all changed. And here we go, 90 miles from Key West, we have this regime, which still, continues to pretty much behave in a similar way. I would not say exactly the same way, but in a similar way.
Yeah, it says something about the stubbornness of the Cuban people. It's a trait that
I can't judge about that.
I can tell you that.
But my interest is basically in terms of the region that is surrounded by the Persian Gulf on one side and the Caspian Sea on the other side. And this is the area that I travel to a great deal. I mentioned that I went there as a Fulbrighter last year during my sabbatical. But that was not my first Fulbright. Actually, I got my first Fulbright in 2000, 3 years just before that. And then my research has been supported by other grants from State Department, Rotary International, and some local think tanks like Arab Research Center in Kuwait, and a number of other ones like Udmurt State University in Russia.
So you're very hopeful about the resolution of all the political unrest and the human rights issues that we have ongoing right now.
Well, my wife says that I am, generally speaking, the type of person who looks at the full side of the cup, and I think that's very true. I have a tendency to look and see issues that some people maybe consider to be a problem is mostly a challenge. Let's look at, for example, some of the current issues now. Perhaps the most contemporary issue nowadays is the prison scandal in Iraq. Well, that issue has certainly caused tremendous amount of concerns among some corners, not only within the policy-making apparatus in our country, but also among masses. I mean, some people question that in the same prison that Saddam Hussein has been torturing his own people. Some of our people have, I wouldn't say they have done exactly the same type of activities as the staff of Saddam Hussein, but they have done things that we Americans are not used to. Humiliation. Exactly. I mean, but you know what? Even during a crisis like that, I can see some silver lining. What I see is the way we are going to be handling this crisis. Let's face it, right after all those tortures, we do not have even one case of Saddam Hussein putting in the court some members of his staff who have tortured the people. I mean, this is well documented. However, what are we doing? We discovered that certain individuals, and this is a very small group, but certain individuals have committed the type of behavior which is not acceptable. So what are we doing? We're prosecuting them. I think this is the value of what we are doing in the region. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think we are trying to show that we are different. And I think this is very important, because I think in living in an interdependent world nowadays, the side that wins is not necessarily the side that wins with the military might. Of course, we have the most effective military machine on earth. There is, I think, no question about that. But it's not the military might that is going to win the heart of Iraqis or other Arabs or people in other parts of the world. I think it's respect for our ideas, respect for our behavior, respect for the way we conduct ourselves and the way we behave toward others. I think that's very important. My favorite line comes from that classical movie Ben-Hur, that the Roman generals are discussing the growth of Christianity in the region, and they are fighting against it, and they're discussing what's the best way to handle it. Well, some of the generals are suggesting killing more, etc. But one of the generals comes up with the idea that, you know what? How do you fight an idea? You can't just fight an idea with, sword. You have to fight an idea with another idea. I think that is a very good advice, especially for nowadays. How do we fight this tradition of dictatorship, etc.? By setting an example for democracy, by showing them that we are different, not just by saying we are different, but by behaving and acting, because people, they look more at our behavior as opposed to our words. Yeah, words are cheap. Words are cheap. Actions are very difficult to stick with and do the right thing. Yeah, so you show that we're similar to that nation, that we do have bad apples. There's bad apples in every culture, but how do we treat our bad apples? Absolutely. We treat them still with respect. We put them through a democratic legal process. Which is fair. And we open everything objective, up. Sure. I think that's what makes the difference between us and I think others, in terms of how we establish procedures that in a fair fashion judges behavior and decides the appropriate punishment or reward.
And we admit it, we don't cover it up.
Absolutely.
At least not for as long as we can.
Transparency is very important for any democracy.
Transparency and honesty, yeah.
Right.
So actually, that seems like very interesting work. Seems like
Well, I think so.
it seems like that would not be a bad area to spend a lot of time doing research on. And you also teach, right?
Absolutely.
So
I think it might sound like a cliche because I know a lot of people mention that, but I seriously think that you can't separate teaching from research. I mean, when I teach and students, especially I like teaching undergraduates because their minds are so fresh and they do not think in a structured way the way we are, you know, trained to think in structured ways. So they ask questions which are sometimes so interesting. So when I do research, I have something to teach about. And when I teach, then I have this like whole data bank of questions that I would like to do some research about. And that's how most of my research comes about. You know, one of the nice things about traveling in the field and doing what I do is not only I collect, you know, aggregate data like many other social scientists, but also I meet a lot of interesting personalities. I have a picture of one of them to show you.
oh, that'd be wonderful.
Okay. This is a picture of me with Grand Ayatollah Bagher Hakim. Now, this individual, he was actually assassinated last summer. I met him last February in, I mean, oh my gosh, time flies. Last February, I don't mean 2004. I mean 2003. Right.
Over a year ago.
Yes, over a year ago in Kuwait. And he spoke like 4 different languages, very open-minded, you know. Was really not the type of person that I expected to meet. I thought I'm going to meet a hard-notch conservative, very difficult to meet.